through an empty field where shadows follow me. I left the things I don't want, but I found what I need. I heard the sound of my pain, and I learned to belong with it. Now
What if the man you trusted most destroyed you with a whisper? What if the daughter you raised betrayed you with a kiss? My name is Maggie Walker, and in one November morning, I walked into my home and straight into a nightmare. The man I called husband, the girl I called daughter, together in my music room, behind a half-closed door. But I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I composed, and now I'll make the entire town hear my pain. Stay until the end, because what you're about to witness is not just revenge, it's the symphony of a woman reborn.
but the sun came to guide me.
Chapter 1. The Echo of Silence. I spent most of my 40 years believing my life was a reflection of perfection. That's how I saw it, or at least, that's how I wanted it to be. Hank, my husband, the respected maestro, and our adopted daughter Jenna, the girl who grew up to the sound of the scores he conducted every night. Music had always been the heartbeat of our home. Music, like a presence, always soft, always safe. The wooden house we shared, with its aged walls, seemed to be our shelter, a reflection of a solid and tranquil life. But like every lie, there were also cracks beginning to open, just waiting for the right moment to show themselves. That November morning, the wind cut through the air with a chilling rigidity, and Hill City was quieter than ever. The mountains in the distance seemed motionless, as if time there dragged on, unhurried. I went out to do some shopping. Something simple, trivial, but the kind of thing that kept my mind occupied, even if only for a few minutes. On the way, snow began to fall softly, covered by a mist that made everything even more distant and unrecognizable. When I returned home, the silence that greeted me was deafening. Not the silence I usually heard when everyone was busy, but that heavy silence, something dense and inevitable. The sound of music, however, came from the music room. A soft melody, which seemed more like a sigh than a song. Something different, something new. I hesitated before entering. My heart, already tight, didn't know what to expect. As I approached the half-open door, that's when I heard Hank's words, whispered with a tenderness I had never heard before. "Play it again, my love. Let the music speak what we cannot say aloud." My stomach churned. He had never called me that. My love? Not in years of marriage. The knot in my throat tightened even more, but I was unable to move my feet. I could only watch through the small opening in the door. The scene I found there, although I had expected something, was not this. Hank was standing, holding Jenna. His arms enveloped his adopted daughter with a softness I never received, and his lips touched her neck with a tenderness that took my breath away. I didn't want to see, but I couldn't look away. "Are you feeling this?" Jenna murmured. I barely heard her. She was so calm, so vulnerable, that the pain I felt came not from explicit betrayal, but from the fact that she, a young woman, was at the center of it all. She knew. She had already lost herself on this path, like me, and it was there that silence fell in a different way. When Jenna, with a tone of someone who already knew the destiny of her words, asked, "What if Mom finds out?" I was paralyzed. It wasn't the betrayal that tore me apart, but the fact that I had never known who Hank was. Not the man I spent 20 years of my life with. Not the man who promised to love me. Not the father I imagined him to be. He was never who I thought. I left without a sound, walking through the city aimlessly, not understanding what was happening to me. The music continued to play, even when I was no longer home. Every note seemed like a crack inside me, stronger than any word I could have said. When I finally returned, I didn't know how to deal with what I had seen. Hank was in the music room with his baton, as if nothing had happened. He conducted the orchestra with the same energy as always, but I knew that nothing there was truer than the pain consuming me. The melody he and Jenna had created now seemed to mock me. my pain, my helplessness. I didn't know what to do. The words were stuck in my throat, and I didn't have the strength to confront him, to talk about what he and Jenna had done. But something inside me began to form. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something that could set me free, something that only I could control. That night, as the sound of music echoed through the house, I knew it would be with music that I would face it all. Not with words, not with screams, but with what had always been the only thing I could trust: music. I didn't yet know what to do with the truth that haunted me, but I knew that this truth would bring something great, something I wasn't prepared to face, but that would find me anyway. Music would be my scream. I knew I needed more than anger or revenge. I needed confirmation, something to tell me what was happening between Hank and Jenna. When I woke up that cold morning, I knew the only way to deal with it was to discover the truth. No longer for what I felt, but for what I needed to understand. I went down to the music room where they both still were. Jenna's violin was in the corner, and something told me there was something hidden in it. Inside its secret compartment, I found the letters from Hank, letters he had written to Jenna months before, confessing his love for her. I looked at the letters, and for a moment, felt the weight of it all, what he had done to me, what he had done with Jenna. But something inside me ignited. I knew now. I wouldn't fight with words, not with screams or revenge. I would fight with the only thing I still possessed, with music. Chapter 2. The Gaze of the Past. I spent hours wandering through the city, aimlessly, without direction. The streets, normally quiet, were deserted, reflecting the emptiness I felt inside me. Snow fell silently, as if the world was trying to hide what was happening, or perhaps it was just me trying to erase everything I saw and heard. I couldn't think straight. Every step I took seemed to distance me from reality, but at the same time brought me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. I knew what I needed to do, but I didn't have the strength to make the decision. The music continued in my head, but it was no longer the soft melody that comforted me. Now, it was like a distant scream, calling me to something I didn't fully comprehend. Music was no longer just something that united my family, but something that now represented my pain, my revenge, my liberation. It was when I entered the antique shop downtown that I noticed something. The dusty window reflected my own image, and there, in that reflection, something broke. I no longer recognized myself. I wasn't Hank's wife, Jenna's mother, but someone who had been abandoned, betrayed, and was now seeking the only thing I had left: control over my own life. I returned home at dusk, the sun still low, as if it didn't want to look at me. The house was silent, but something told me there was something more there, something I needed to understand. When I entered, I went straight to the music room, where the echoes of betrayal still lingered in the air. It was hard to breathe there, but it was also the only place where I felt I could finally take control of my life. The chords that had echoed in my memories now seemed like a different song. It was as if the music I played was an extension of my own pain. I sat at the piano, my fingers touching the keys without really thinking. Each note seemed like a liberation, an expression of anger, sadness, and somehow an attempt at healing. But it was when I picked up Jenna's violin, the violin I now knew held secrets, that the truth began to reveal itself. Hank's letters, which I found in the violin's secret compartment, were not just words written with passion. They were promises, declarations of love he would never make to me. I knew he was trying to redeem himself, but I no longer knew if I wanted to hear his apologies. He had destroyed everything between us, and perhaps it was too late for any kind of explanation. With the letters in hand, I went to the studio downtown, a place where no one knew me, where no one knew my past, and where, for the first time, I felt free. I began to compose, no longer to avenge Hank, but to understand who I really was now. Music became my answer, my way of dealing with pain, of rebuilding my identity. Weeks passed, and each day I delved deeper into the notes that filled the score. I knew that 1537 would be my answer, not just to Hank, but to myself. The composition wasn't just about the pain of betrayal, but about my struggle to be who I really was, without the expectations of others. I was no longer willing to be just Hank's wife or Jenna's mother. I wanted to be Maggie, in all my complexity and pain. When the big concert arrived, I still didn't know what would happen. But I knew that there would be the stage where everything would be resolved, where my truth would be exposed, not in words, but through music. I didn't know what Hank would feel, but what I felt was already enough. On the night of the concert, I was in the dressing room, trying to calm the anxiety running through my veins. The red velvet dress squeezed me, and the piano before me seemed more like a menacing presence than a friend. The applause echoing from outside seemed distant, as if the world was no longer the same. The room was silent, but inside me, everything was in full agitation. Hank was on stage, his baton raised, as always, but something in the air was different, something I couldn't yet comprehend. I knew he was no longer in control. He was no longer leading the orchestra he once believed was his life, his perfection. He didn't know, but I had already made the decision. 1537 would not just be a piece. It would be my answer, not of anger, but of liberation. I stood up and walked to the stage, the sound of the orchestra in the background becoming a distant backdrop to what I was about to do. When I sat at the piano, something in me calmed down. It was as if I was finally home. The music I composed was no longer just a response to what he did to me, but a celebration of my own strength. The first chords of 1537 began to fill the theater. It wasn't a song of revenge. It was a song of transformation. Each note sounded like a beat of my heart, stronger, freer. I was playing for myself, not for Hank, not for anyone else. I was playing for the woman I had become, the woman who was finally discovering herself. As the music echoed through the theater walls, I saw Hank's face on stage. He was visibly disconcerted, realizing that this was not what he expected. The confusion in his eyes made me realize how much he had never truly known who I was. I wasn't there to please him. I wasn't there to be the wife he betrayed. I was there to be me, Maggie, and that was enough. The notes of 1537 were not just a cry of pain, but of rebirth. I played each chord with the intensity of someone finally breaking free. The theater was in absolute silence, but I knew that this was not just a performance. It was my truth being played for the world to hear. And it was there, at that moment, that true liberation happened. Chapter 3. The Silent Confrontation. The silence of the audience seemed to reverberate deep within my soul, as if the entire theater was suspended in an endless moment. The melody of 1537 still echoed in my mind, but now, the music was no longer about revenge, nor about suffering. It was about something greater, something I didn't know I possessed. I had played each chord with the intensity of pain, anger, liberation, but also with the calm that came from discovering myself stronger than I ever imagined. I knew that nothing would be the same again, but at the same time, I had no idea what would come next. What would happen now that I had finally freed myself from the weight of Hank, the expectations of Jenna, and even my own illusions? The stage was empty, but my heart was pounding, as if the real concert was just beginning. As the audience began to rise, applauding, the feeling of despair I felt moments before now seemed distant, like a memory beginning to fade. I looked backstage, where I knew Hank would be watching me, but what I didn't expect was the presence of someone who, somehow, made me freeze. Eduardo. He was there, standing at the back of the stage, watching me with those intense eyes I hadn't seen in so long. Eduardo, my friend's ex-husband. The man who, for some reason, always had a presence in my life, but whom I never expected to be part of this moment. He wasn't someone I wanted to remember, but there he was, applauding my performance with a sincerity that disconcerted me. I froze. What did he want from me now? What was he doing there? I didn't know if I felt anger or confusion, or perhaps something more, something I didn't want to acknowledge. When the applause began to die down and the audience began to disperse, Eduardo didn't move. He remained there, with that gaze that wouldn't let me escape. I descended the stage slowly, my heart still pounding. The sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty hall seemed like a reminder of what had just happened. I had played for myself, for my soul, but now, in the midst of that emptiness, everything seemed to flow into something more, something I didn't know if I wanted to face. I didn't know what to expect from Eduardo. He had always been an enigmatic figure in my life. Sometimes, he seemed to be a comforting presence, a shadow in my past that had always been there, without causing much fuss. But now, he seemed to be bringing something I wasn't ready to face. When I approached him, he didn't move. He stood there in silence, as if waiting for something. I didn't know what to say, but my mouth went dry, and the words wouldn't come out. I just watched him for a moment, trying to understand what he wanted. I began, my voice faltering, still trying to understand the confusion forming in my chest. You're here. Why? Eduardo looked at me with an expression that, although serious, was not judgmental. There was no anger in his eyes, just a silent understanding that made me question what he knew that I didn't yet. I saw your music, Maggie, he said, his voice low but clear. I saw your pain transformed into something beautiful, something greater than I imagined. I never thought you were capable of something like this, but it's incredible. Not just the music, but the way you reinvented yourself. His words hit me like an electric shock. I didn't know how to react. Eduardo had always been someone on the sidelines of my life, but I never thought he would see what I saw that night. He didn't know the pain I carried. He didn't know about the sacrifices, the silences, the betrayal that ran through my veins. But at the same time, he seemed to see beyond that. He seemed to see me in a way no one ever had. You don't understand, Eduardo, I said, my voice now firmer. It's not just about the music. It's not just about revenge or pain. This is about me. I don't know who I am anymore, and you have no right to come here and talk about what you think you saw. I knew I was starting to lose control. Eduardo was never someone I discussed the deepest things in my life with, but there, at the back of the stage, he seemed to be the last person I wanted in front of me. He didn't know what this meant to me. He didn't know what I left behind to get here. He took a step forward, his gaze no longer defiant, but filled with something I couldn't identify. I didn't come to challenge you, Maggie, he said, his voice calm, but laden with some sadness. I just wanted you to know that I saw your music, and I saw the woman you became. I saw freedom. I took a deep breath, trying to process Eduardo's words. He was right, in a way. I had freed myself, but the question that consumed me was, what to do now? The music had already been played. My truth was already there, on stage, exposed for all. But Eduardo seemed to want more. He wanted to see something I wasn't yet willing to show. He wanted to see more of the woman I had become. You're right, Eduardo, I said, my voice softer now, but without losing firmness. I freed myself, but now, I don't know what to do with it. I don't know if that means you have the right to understand everything I went through. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of approval. It was a sad smile, as if he knew more than I was ready to admit. I don't have that right, Maggie, but you'll understand in time. Freedom doesn't need an explanation. It simply is yours. I looked at him once more, the feeling of distrust still lingering over me. I didn't know what Eduardo wanted. He seemed to be there just to observe me, like a silent witness to my process. But at the same time, he brought something I didn't expect. He made me understand that I didn't need anyone to be free. I had already made my own way, even if he didn't fully understand. Without another word, I turned and began to walk towards backstage, where I knew Hank was still waiting. What would he do now? I didn't know, but one thing I was sure of, nothing he did could change what had happened that night. And, as I walked towards the door, I heard Eduardo walking away. The sound of his footsteps made me stop for a second, but not long enough to look back. I knew what I was leaving behind. I knew that now I was stronger. I didn't need anyone else. Chapter 4. The Weight of Truth. The theater was almost empty now. The last people began to leave, but I stayed there, motionless on stage, applauded, recognized, but I didn't know if I was really there, if what had just happened was real. The sound of the music still echoed in my mind, no longer as revenge, but as a cry of liberation. But the peace I felt was about to be interrupted. I knew what was coming next. Hank. He was somewhere, waiting to see me. I didn't know what he wanted or what he thought was possible. In fact, I didn't care. He had already lost everything. The only thing he still had, and that I didn't want, was a false idea of control. I left the stage without looking back and walked backstage. The sound of my footsteps echoing in those empty walls was the only thing that reminded me I was still in the same place. The music room was in front of me, the place where it all began, where the notes of pain transformed into something stronger, and I knew that would be the place where the final confrontation would happen. Hank was there in the center of the room, with his baton in his hands, as if preparing for another rehearsal. I wanted to laugh. He was so out of sync with what had happened, so immersed in his own illusion of control, that I wondered how he still believed he could command anything. When he saw me, something in his face changed. It was as if, for the first time, he realized that everything he had done could not be corrected by a simple apology. He seemed fragile, tired, as if he already knew the battle was lost before it even began. He wasn't the Hank I knew, the man with immense pride. He was no longer the man who once controlled my life, my emotions, my choices. I knew he was facing something he had never known how to face, the truth. "You did what you had to do, Maggie," he said, his voice laden with weariness. He tried to smile, but the expression seemed forced, as if he was trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. I didn't move. "I know I hurt you. I know what I did, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that I can't change it." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt something I never imagined feeling. Compassion. Not for him, but for the woman I was, the woman who gave herself to this man, who believed his lies. I looked at him with a clarity I had never had before. He was just a man, flawed like any other, and I no longer needed him to validate my own existence. I didn't need his pity or his apologies. I was already beyond that. "Do you think you owe me something, Hank?" I said, my voice firm but calm. "Do you think that, with these words, you're going to make me feel something for you again?" "No, Hank. I don't need any more apologies. I don't need anything else from you. What you gave me was a lie. What I gained was freedom." Hank lowered his head, the baton in his hands now a useless weight. He couldn't look at me anymore. It was as if the man he imagined himself to be had disappeared, and he, without control of his life and our choices, was lost. There was nothing more he could offer me. "I know what you think, Maggie," he said, with an expression of despair. "But believe me, I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't want to hear anymore. No more empty words." "You knew, Hank," I replied. "You knew very well what you were doing. Every word you wrote to her, every touch you gave, every lie you told me. You knew." The pain I felt was no longer about him. It was no longer about what he did to me. It was about everything I stopped being to please him. I lost myself in this man for so long, and now, before him, all I felt was the weight of freedom. The freedom not to depend on him. The freedom not to need his words, his lies, his presence anymore. "I don't want anything else from you, Hank," I said, my voice now cold. "You lost me, and now, it's my turn." Hank seemed to crumble before me. He wanted to speak, wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. He walked away, slowly, to the door, his head bowed. I didn't follow him. There was no longer any reason to. When he left, I stood there, in the center of the room, once again alone, but in a different way. I was no longer lost. I was no longer waiting for something from him. I knew my journey was mine. I had freed myself. But then, before I could fully process what had just happened, I heard the sound of someone's footsteps. Someone else was coming. I turned, and there was Jenna. She stood at the door, her eyes fixed on me, but not as before. Not with the expression of a daughter still seeking her mother's approval. She seemed different, more mature, more lost. You did what you needed to do, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling but firm. I didn't know what to answer. I didn't know what she wanted from me. She took a step forward, as if trying to approach, but something in her gaze prevented me from going to her. "Jenna, it's not about you and me," I said, my voice soft, but with an intensity she couldn't deny. "I'm not here to save you anymore. I'm no longer the person you think I am. I am the woman who learned to save herself. And you, Jenna, you need to do that too." I watched her, waiting for a reaction. I knew she was hurt, that what she had done to me could not be erased, but I could no longer be the person who took care of everything. I could no longer be the woman who sacrificed herself for her. I needed her to be able to save herself. She looked at me, and something in her gaze made me feel a pang of regret. But it was no longer the regret from before. It was the regret of someone who had lost herself, but who was beginning to understand what truly mattered. I don't know what to do, Maggie," she murmured. "I don't know how to fix everything I did." I didn't know what to say. What could I say to the girl who had betrayed me, who had lost herself on the path Hank prepared for her? But I knew she had to find her own way to get back on her feet. I had already done that. Now it was her turn. "I know you don't understand, but you will," I said, my voice calm, but full of a strength that only those who have been through pain could understand. "You will understand that the only person who can save you now is yourself. Jenna stood there, in silence, but something in her gaze said she understood. And perhaps, at that moment, she had begun to understand that life was not about trying to fix what was broken, but about moving forward, even with the scars. When she finally walked away, I was left alone, once again. But now, there was no more anger or pain. I was at peace. The music playing in my mind now was mine. It was no longer about Hank or Jenna, but about who I am. I no longer needed anyone to define me. I was enough. In this chapter, Maggie finally confronts Hank and realizes that her true liberation comes not from forgiveness or explanations, but from her own decision to move forward. She also has a brief but significant confrontation with Jenna, offering her the chance to save herself, but without taking responsibility for it. This marks an important turning point in Maggie's journey. Shall we continue with the next chapter, where Maggie begins to deal with the final transformation and the choices that now lie before her? She is finally alone, but this puts her before new questions about her future, what she truly desires, and what freedom means to her. Chapter 5. The Weight of Freedom. I stayed on stage longer than I should have. The sound of my footsteps slowly faded, as if the house itself knew that something definitive had happened. Looking at the empty theater, the weight of the music still filled the air. It was no longer the melody of revenge, but that of a new beginning, a beginning I wasn't ready to embrace, but which somehow found me there, alone, stronger, more whole. Hank had already left, Jenna too. The silence between us was no longer an echo of unspoken words, but of decisions made. And despite being the deepest silence I had ever experienced, it brought with it something rare, peace. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night fall upon my shoulders, and for the first time, I felt capable of making a decision without needing approval, without needing justifications. The decision had already been made, but what would come now? What would I do with the freedom I had finally achieved? It wasn't just the freedom of no longer being Hank's wife or Jenna's mother. It was the freedom to be who I really am, without fear of losing myself in the expectations of others. I left the stage and walked through the theater corridors. The silence was oppressive, but I felt no fear. I was alone, but not empty. On the contrary, I felt more full of myself than ever. As I passed backstage, I realized that something in me had changed. The empty conversations, the masks I wore to hide, all that seemed so distant now. I had finally found myself in the midst of pain, and I knew that the pain wouldn't disappear, but it no longer controlled me. I was the owner of my story now. Upon reaching the back door of the theater, I hesitated. Something told me I should leave through there, not to be seen, not to have to face the questions I knew would come. I could run away, but instead, I turned to the front door. I needed to look at what I left behind, at who I was before, at the faces I saw in the audience, the applause that cheered me. I needed to accept that, finally, I was no longer what they expected of me. It was when I left the theater that the feeling of emptiness dissipated, and the weight of freedom hit me like a wave. There was nothing holding me back anymore. No guilt, no fear. I was facing a new life, and it was no longer strange to me. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew it would be my choice, my only choice. The street was empty, except for a small breeze cutting through the air. The city lights flickered like distant lighthouses, but the feeling of finally being alone didn't scare me. I had lived much of my life for others, trying to please, trying to save, trying to be what was expected of me. But now, there, in the shadows of the night, there was only me. No more promises to keep, no more people to save. I looked at the moon, which now rose above me, as a symbol that the world was moving, and I was just beginning to move with it. It was then that I saw the silhouette of someone approaching, almost invisible in the darkness. It wasn't Hank. It wasn't Jenna. It was someone I, for a moment, thought I had forgotten. Eduardo. He was there, standing at the end of the street, looking at me as if he had been waiting for that moment since the beginning. I didn't know what he wanted. I didn't know what he expected from me. But there was something in his gaze that made me think he was also there to see who I really was now. Not the wife he knew, or the woman he imagined me to be, but Maggie, the woman who had finally found herself. I took a deep breath and began to walk towards him. I didn't know what to say. What would he say? The night was silent, but each step seemed to bring me closer to something I didn't want to understand. something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "You looked for me, Maggie," he said when he finally saw me. His voice was calm, almost soft, but there was a tension in his words, as if he knew that moment, somehow, was the last. "I saw what you did. I saw what you became. And as much as I've kept my distance, something in me can't help but see the woman you've become." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel bothered. He watched me not with judgment, but with a quietness that seemed strange to me. There was no anger, no regret. There was only a silent acceptance, as if he was seeing something I didn't even know existed. "I don't know what you expect from me, Eduardo," I said, my voice low, but full of a firmness that surprised me. "There's nothing more to be said between us. There's nothing more to be explained." He took a step forward, but without touching me. "I know, Maggie. I know you freed yourself, and I know you don't need me anymore. But seeing what you did, I realized that perhaps you did what we all need to do, Maggie. Not for me, not for Hank, but for yourself." I looked at him, trying to understand what he meant. It was more than a simple statement. It was a truth he seemed to understand in a way I couldn't yet fully grasp. I had done something much greater than anyone could expect. I didn't do it for revenge. I didn't do it to be accepted. I did it because finally, it was the only choice I had. The choice to be who I really am. "I know you don't need me, Maggie," he said, his voice now softer. "But for some reason, I couldn't help but hope that one day you would find your way. And now I see that you have." I looked at him, a mix of confusion and understanding washing over me. I didn't know if what he said was a relief or a burden, but I knew that, deep down, he was right. I had finally found my way, and he was there to witness it. But it didn't matter. I didn't need anyone's validation. "Eduardo, you're right," I said, my voice firmer now. "I found my way, and now, you must follow yours." Without another word, I started walking forward, feeling Eduardo's eyes on me. There was nothing more to be said. There was nothing more to be resolved. I was finally free. Chapter 6. The Path Ahead. The freedom I felt after the concert was strange, as if something was still suspended, waiting to be finally understood. It was no longer about the pain of betrayal or the silent revenge through music, but about something more complex. What to do with the empty space that had formed now that the battle was over. I was no longer the woman who was deceived, the betrayed wife. But who then was I? What was I seeking now? The following days were a mix of contradictory feelings. I felt stronger than ever, but also full of uncertainties. I knew that the music I played that night would not be the last, but how to move forward? I had no plan. I didn't know what to do with everything I had discovered about myself. The pain that once consumed me was now an emptiness, and it was in that emptiness that I found myself. I left home early, seeking some kind of answer, something that could guide me. I walked through the city streets, the clear sky above me like a blank canvas. I passed by the theater, but unlike before, I didn't stop to look at the building. There was nothing more I could see there. The past had already been resolved, and the future, well, the future was now. It was when I passed a small coffee shop, hidden between two stores, that something pulled me inside. The aroma of coffee reminded me of the peaceful mornings Hank and I spent together, before everything broke. I hesitated before entering, but I made the move, driven by the feeling that perhaps it was time to find something more than emptiness. The interior of the coffee shop was cozy, with soft light and the sound of quiet conversation in the background. I sat at a table near the window, and while waiting for my coffee, I began to observe the people around me. They were there, talking, laughing, lost in their own lives, and I, somehow, felt like a stranger. But not strange in the way I thought. I no longer felt excluded, but part of something bigger. Perhaps the world around me hadn't changed, but I, definitely, had changed. I knew I was facing a new beginning, but at the same time, I had no idea how to build this new me. I had music, but music alone wasn't everything. I wanted more. I didn't know what, but I wanted to feel alive again. I wanted to feel that my life was no longer defined by Hank's choices or Jenna's mistakes. I wanted to be the author of my own story. It was then that someone approached my table, interrupting my thoughts. When I looked up, Clarice's face appeared before me, like a vision from the past. I knew her well. She was a fellow pianist, someone who had always been by my side during rehearsals, but also a friend who, somehow, seemed to understand the nuances of my pain. "Maggie," she said with a soft smile, "may I sit down?" I gestured with my hand, inviting her to sit, and she settled into the chair across from me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I should talk about what happened or if I should move on. Clarice seemed to understand the tension, as she wasn't the first to speak. "I saw what you did, Maggie," she said, her voice calm and direct. "I saw how you transformed before everyone, and I know you don't want to talk about it, but I just want to say that I always knew you had a strength that even you didn't see." I looked at her, trying to understand her words. Clarice was always so discreet, so reserved, that I never imagined she noticed how much I was destroying myself. But there she was, observing me in a way that made me feel that I wasn't alone. I didn't know what to do with my own life, Clarice," I said, my voice faltering for a moment. "I lost myself for so long trying to be what others wanted, trying to please, trying to save, and now, after everything, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what comes next." She looked at me with an expression of understanding, as if she had been waiting for those words. "You don't need to have all the answers now, Maggie," she replied softly. "Sometimes we get lost to find ourselves again, and now you have an opportunity to rebuild your life the way you want." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. I knew she was right. There was nothing more I could do with the past. But at the same time, the future was before me, and I didn't know how to take the reins. Clarice continued, as if reading my thoughts. "I know you're at peace with your music, Maggie, but I also know that music isn't everything. You'll discover that. But I also know that when you find yourself again, you'll be stronger than ever." I looked at her and saw something in her eyes I didn't expect: hope. Clarice wasn't just trying to comfort me, she was challenging me to go further. And for the first time, I saw this as an opportunity. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Not to Hank, not to Jenna, not to Clarice. I just needed to prove myself to myself. "I don't know what I'm going to do now, Clarice," I said, with a lightness I hadn't felt before. "But somehow I know I'll figure it out. I have the freedom for that, and I'm finally ready to choose." She smiled, as if she had finally seen what I hadn't seen before. "You're going to make wonderful choices, Maggie," she said, her voice full of confidence. "I know you will." She stood up and, with a last smile, left the coffee shop, and I stayed there, alone again, but not in a sad way. I was with someone I never left behind, the woman who learned to save herself. I didn't know what the future held for me, but at that moment, I felt more alive than I ever had. It wasn't the life I expected, but it was the life I needed now. It was mine. Mystery on the Chapter 7, The Challenge of Freedom. It was an ordinary day, but for me, everything seemed different. I still felt the weight of the music in my mind, but now it no longer consumed me. It became part of who I was, an extension of my journey, but not the only thing that defined me. I was beginning to realize what my freedom truly meant. It wasn't just the absence of Hank, or Jenna, or any other element of my past. It was something deeper, something that told me that I, finally, could write my own story. I still didn't know what to do with what life had brought me, but I knew I needed to find out. I started looking for something outside my past, something that would give me a new purpose. And, as much as I tried to fill the void, I realized that nothing would be enough until I faced myself. The problem now wasn't the people around me. The problem was what I felt inside me, a need to restart, but without knowing how. It was then that, one day, while walking through the city streets, I passed a bookstore. Something in that window caught my attention. It wasn't a specific book, but the feeling that perhaps there I would find what I was looking for. I entered, and the smell of old books enveloped me like a hug. The silence inside that store was welcoming. I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't have an agenda. I was there to get lost. I went through several shelves until a book caught my eye. The title was simple, but there was something about it that made me pick it up immediately. The Art of Reinvention. I leafed through it without knowing exactly what I was looking for, but something in the words began to resonate within me. It was about people who got lost, like me, and about how they found their way back. It wasn't just about music or the pains of the past, but about the journey anyone could take to create something new of themselves. I knew this book wasn't just a simple book. It was a key. I bought it, and that night I would lock myself in my studio to see what it could show me. Sitting at the table, With the book open in front of me, I began to read. The words began to make sense as I progressed. Reinvention is not about forgetting what you were, but understanding that you can be more than you imagined. These words struck me. I had never seen freedom this way. It wasn't a matter of leaving the past behind, but of embracing it and realizing that it no longer defines who I am. The book didn't give me all the answers, but it gave me something more important, a perspective. I needed to reinvent my purpose. I needed to accept that what I lived and what I was were parts of a story, but not the whole story. My story was just beginning, and I had the chance to rewrite what I wanted to be. Music would be part of it, but not the only thing. I needed to expand, to go further, and I knew that the first step would be to move away from what I believed to be my comfort zone. I didn't know what the future held for me. I didn't know if I should go back to teaching music or if I should completely distance myself from the musical world. But somehow I felt that my journey was not just linked to music. I needed to explore new ways of being, new ways of expressing who I am. Perhaps it was time to start something new, something that was no longer related to pain or revenge, but to healing and discovery. It was then that I decided that, the next day, I would look for something new. I wanted to do something that challenged me, something that took me out of the place where I always felt safe. I didn't know if it would be a new career, a new artistic project, or something completely different. But I knew I needed to take the first step. And the first step was to allow myself the freedom to explore new possibilities. As I left my studio that night, I passed by a restaurant window and saw something that made me stop. It wasn't a familiar face. It was just a common scene. A man and a woman dining, talking, laughing. But something there made me think about what was missing. I had closed myself off to all of this. Relationships, connections. I felt distant, unable to open my heart to another person. And perhaps that was what prevented me from moving forward. I was no longer stuck in my past, but I felt disconnected from the present. I needed to learn to connect again. I didn't know what to do with this realization, but deep down, I knew that what I needed was not more answers, but more action. I had no more time to lose. I had spent too much time hiding, too much time trying to escape what really mattered. I needed to go back into the world, not as the woman I was before, but as the woman I was becoming, the woman who had the courage to look inside herself and accept that there were no limits to who she could be. The challenge of freedom would not be easy, but in the end, it would be mine. The choice to be who I really am. And as much as I was still lost in some aspects, I knew that the true challenge was to allow myself to walk this new journey. Chapter 8. The Awakening of Courage. The sun was low, casting a golden glow over the city, and I felt at peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from a quiet rest, but from a deeper place, where you finally feel comfortable in your own skin. I still didn't know what the future held for me, but I knew one thing. I was ready to discover it. I was ready to embark on this new beginning that no longer seemed so distant. The morning after my encounter with the book, The Art of Reinvention, I woke up with a clear goal in mind. I would no longer wait for things to happen. I had the power to create my own reality, and I finally understood that. Music was part of who I am, but it wouldn't be the only path I would follow. I wanted something more. I decided that, first and foremost, I needed to reconnect with the world, with people, with the things that made me feel alive. I was tired of hiding, of taking refuge in my own memories and pains. I needed to act, and for that, I made the decision to return to the music school where I started, not to go back as a teacher or to give lessons, but as someone who wanted to experience the pleasure of pure art again, without pressure or expectations. The school was on the other side of the city, but the path seemed short to me, as if the streets that once seemed endless were now just steps to the new. I arrived at the school with a sense of strangeness, but at the same time, a sense of belonging. The door was open, and I was soon greeted by a teacher who looked at me with some curiosity. "You're back," she said, a slight smile on her lips. I just nodded, trying not to hide my nervousness. It was hard not to feel the pressure of those walls, but at the same time, I felt that the time I spent there was not a burden. I was no longer trying to fit in. I was there to rediscover the magic of music in a new way, without the constraints I used to feel. I spent the first few hours observing, feeling the energy of the school again, listening to discussions about music theory and the sound of scores being played with energy. It was the kind of environment that in the past gave me comfort. But now, instead of feeling small, as before, I felt free. I no longer needed to be the perfectionist, the strict teacher, the woman who always had the answers. I could just be myself, playing for pleasure, learning again. I borrowed a violin and began to play, not with the expectation of pleasing anyone, nor of proving myself to others, but to feel the music flowing through my veins again, to reconnect with the joy of creating. And, as the notes began to emerge, I felt more alive than I had ever felt in all these years. There was no more pressure. There was nothing more to prove. I was just a woman with her music, rediscovering herself. After a few hours, I left the room, feeling that I had done something important. The touch of the violin, the notes that echoed in the room, were a reminder of who I was before everything broke. But at the same time, they were a reflection of who I was becoming. I was no longer lost in the past. I was part of the present, and that was liberating. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that the future was in my hands. I still didn't know which path to follow, but I was beginning to understand that the choices I had and would have were no longer about others. They weren't about pleasing Hank or Jenna or anyone else. They were about me. It was then that I began to explore new possibilities. I always wanted to write. I never had the courage, always put art in the background, but now I felt I couldn't wait any longer. I didn't know if I was good or if I would ever be able to turn it into something meaningful. But as I opened the notebook, pen in hand, I felt something inside me change. I wasn't just writing for myself. I was writing because I needed to. I needed to give voice to the words that had always been kept inside. I wrote about what I had lived, about my search for myself, about pain, loss, and above all, about the freedom I was now beginning to understand. The words flowed like music. They weren't perfect, but they were mine. And deep down, that was what really mattered. As the days passed, I found myself more attentive to the world around me. The people I met, the small daily interactions, everything seemed to have a new meaning. I was no longer living to please others or to hide my weaknesses. I was living for myself, for my own satisfaction, for my own peace. It was then that, on a sunny afternoon, I decided to sign up for a literary event in the city, something I would never have done before. I didn't know what would come of it, or if anyone would ever read what I wrote, but I was ready to try, to embark on this new chapter. Freedom was more than just moving away from something or someone. It was about creating, building, and connecting with what truly matters. I didn't know if I would be a great writer, or if one day the words I wrote would touch someone, but I knew I was taking the first step towards something much bigger, something that deeply involved me, and that no one could take away from me. I no longer had all the answers, but now I didn't need them. What I needed was to keep walking, and for that, I had the necessary courage. I was beginning to understand that there is no single path, and that the choices I would make, even without a plan, would lead me where I needed to go. Chapter 9. The fear of change. The feeling of freedom I experienced every day was still new to me. It was no longer just the freedom of not being defined by others or by the expectations I imposed on myself. It was an internal freedom, something deeper and more complex. But as I progressed on this journey, I began to realize that along with freedom came something I didn't expect: fear. I was no longer bound by what I left behind, but I was now facing a new beginning. And with it came the big question I didn't know if I wanted to ask. Am I really capable of living all this? Do I deserve this new path? I was never a person full of certainties, and the fear of failing, of making mistakes, of getting lost again in my own insecurities was now stronger than ever. There was something incredibly liberating about being able to choose my own path, but at the same time, there was a weight to it. I was no longer living to please others, but for myself, and that brought a silent pressure. I had the power to create my story. But what if the story I created wasn't good enough? What if I failed? That morning, after another sleepless night reflecting on my new life, I woke up determined to do something new. I was about to send the manuscript of my first book, something I never imagined I would have the courage to do. I knew it was still a beginning, and that I would probably face many rejections. But the simple act of sending that manuscript represented more than any external victory. It was confirmation that I had taken a step forward without looking back. The envelope was in my hands, and I hesitated before putting it in the mail. My heart was racing, and the words of encouragement Clarice told me still echoed in my mind. "You're going to make wonderful choices, Maggie," she said. And although I knew that, somehow she was right. Fear still clung to me. What if no one cared about what I wrote? What if no one read it? What would I do with that fear? I forced myself to take the step. I put the envelope in the mailbox and closed it, feeling a wave of relief mixed with overwhelming fear. It was as if a part of me had thrown itself into an unknown abyss, but at the same time, I knew I could no longer live in a state of uncertainty. I had taken the first step in a direction I couldn't turn back from. Now, all that remained was to move forward. In the following days, I continued my writing exercises, trying to create something new. I felt uncomfortable and insecure all the time. Sometimes, I wondered if this change was really good for me. Was there something in my past that I still hadn't processed? Something that somehow prevented me from moving forward with the certainty I so desired? It was then that one night, when I got home after a long day, I found a letter on my table. It wasn't addressed to me, but to my name. I opened it with hesitation, and as I read, a feeling of strangeness came over me. The letter was from a publisher. They had read my manuscript. "Dear Maggie," the letter read, "we were impressed with your work. Your manuscript has a rare authenticity, and we would like to discuss the possibility of publishing it." My heart pounded. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Everything I had done so far, all my insecurities and fears, had led me there. But what did that mean? I was still adjusting to this new life, to the new Maggie who had begun to write with courage. Now, the possibility of having my work published made me question if I was really ready to face the world. I looked at the letter again, trying to process everything that was happening. Part of me wanted to scream, to celebrate, but another part felt a deep fear that it was all an illusion. Was I ready to be someone who would be read by others? Was I ready for this new life where my truth would be exposed? I knew this was the greatest opportunity I could have, but I also knew that it meant I would have to expose my vulnerability. And once again, I felt that fear that paralyzed me, that fear of failing, the fear of not being enough. It was as if, deep down, I was still looking for approval from something or someone. But who, after all, was I waiting to approve my life now? Was I still seeking external validation for the happiness I had finally found within myself? I took a deep breath and at that moment realized that the biggest challenge was not moving forward. The biggest challenge was to trust myself, trust that this new life, with all its ups and downs, was mine to live. I was creating my own story now, and although fear was still present, it no longer had the power to stop me. That fear was the last piece of the puzzle. It was what I still lacked to finally be the woman I wanted to be. Not a perfect woman, but a woman who accepts herself, who embraces her fears and moves forward with courage. I put the letter back on the table and smiled to myself. It didn't matter what happened now. What mattered was that I had taken the first step, and more importantly, that I was ready to take the next. Chapter 10. The Weight of Success. I never imagined it would be so difficult to take the next step. When I received the publisher's response, the feeling of victory was instantaneous, but at the same time, an uncomfortable doubt began to infiltrate my gut. I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but I didn't imagine how heavy the weight of success would be. It was no longer about being good enough for others. It was no longer about pleasing Hank or Jenna. It was about being good enough for myself, and that somehow seemed even harder. The publisher wanted a meeting. They were interested in my manuscript, and I felt like a child who, for the first time, was about to enter a universe where the rules were new, and I didn't know if I had what it took to play the game. I went to their office, a modern building of glass and steel, very different from the small, familiar world of Hill City. It was as if I was entering a new phase, where the rules and expectations were even more challenging. When I entered the meeting room, what awaited me was nothing like I expected. The editor-in-chief was an imposing woman with dark hair and sharp eyes. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and gestured me to the chair in front of her. It wasn't a warm reception, but a professional one, and I knew I needed to live up to it. "First, Maggie, I'd like to congratulate you," she began, looking directly into my eyes. "Your manuscript truly stood out among those we received. There's something in it that's uncommon, an authenticity that immediately drew us in. But before we talk about contracts and next steps, I'd like to understand more about what inspired you to write this. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the anxiety forming in my chest. It wasn't the first time I talked about my story. It wasn't the first time I explained where my pain came from. But it was the first time I talked about it with an interested audience, with someone who was truly looking at what I had created. I wrote because, at some point in my life, I realized that pain shouldn't consume me. It was a part of me, but it wasn't all I was. Music, people, relationships, mistakes, all of that was part of my journey. And writing was a way to try to understand what I couldn't comprehend before. I wanted to rescue something of myself that had been lost. She observed me in silence for a moment, writing something in her notebook. I didn't know what she was thinking, but her serious and impassive expression made me even more nervous. The silence felt like a weight, and every word I said seemed dragged out, as if she was waiting for something more from me. "I understand," she said finally, "and I believe readers will understand too. However, there's a question of how this authenticity connects with the audience. How do you see that? What is your biggest fear, Maggie?" That question caught me by surprise. I thought I had already faced my fears, but it was clear that there was still something inside me that I didn't want to admit. The fear of failing, of not being enough, of being seen as weak or as someone who hadn't truly overcome what she went through. Hank or Jenna were no longer in my life, but I knew that what I truly feared was vulnerability. Exposure. The world was about to see who I really am. I think my biggest fear is being seen as a fraud, I said suddenly. I'm afraid that when people read it, they won't see the truth. I'm afraid they'll look at me and see only someone who's trying to be something she's not, because sometimes even I don't know who I really am. She looked at me with an intensity that made me feel as if she was looking inside me, at all my weaknesses and insecurities. But instead of judging me, she smiled softly. "That's natural, Maggie," she said, her voice softer now. "But what you have to understand is that no one has all the answers. True strength doesn't come from hiding your weaknesses, but from accepting them, from not being afraid to show them. You've already taken a significant step by writing about your journey. Now, what you need to do is not care what others will think. They will connect with your truth. That's what matters." Her words stayed with me long after the meeting. I left the office with a contract in hand, but also with a sense of uncertainty. I knew this was a big step, but at the same time, the weight of responsibility hit me. It wasn't just about the book. It was about my life, about the woman I was becoming, and about the courage I still needed to find. In the following days, anxiety began to take over me again. I didn't know if I was ready for this new life. I didn't know if I was capable of dealing with the weight of exposure, with the possibility of being judged, of being analyzed. I always thought that music was the purest form of expressing myself, but now, with writing, I felt an even greater vulnerability. I was exposing myself in a way I never thought I was capable of. But as the final manuscript submission day approached, I began to notice something I hadn't noticed before. Fear was still there, but somehow, it became a part of me that I accepted. The fear of failing, the fear of being judged, the fear of not being good enough, all of that was part of the process. It wasn't something I needed to overcome, but something I should accept as I walked towards my future. I was learning more and more each day that true freedom is not getting rid of fears, but accepting that they are part of who we are and moving forward despite them. And when I finally sent the manuscript to the publisher, a sense of peace came over me. Not the peace of someone who has all the answers, but the peace of someone who finally understood that the journey is not about perfection. It's about the act of continuing, of exposing yourself, and of creating, even when fears seem unbearable. I was finally ready for this new life, and that, more than any contract or recognition, was the true victory. Chapter 11, The Weight of Choice. When I received the final response from the publisher, I felt like I was in another world. The words that once seemed distant were now within my reach, and what once seemed like a fantasy, an illusion of a different life, was now my reality. The contract was signed, the book was about to be published, and I was about to change once and for all. But although the feeling of accomplishment was inevitable, there was a shadow hanging over me. It was no longer the fear of failure or the doubt that my words wouldn't be good enough. It was something more subtle, deeper. I felt strange, as if the weight of being who I am now was something I still didn't know how to carry. Freedom was, without a doubt, one of the greatest victories I had ever achieved. But at the same time, it brought an emptiness. I was taking the first step to becoming the woman I always wanted to be. But how would this fit into my daily life? How would this woman adapt to society, to old friends, to the remaining expectations of a past I no longer wanted to carry? Life now seemed like a vast open field, but at the same time, it was frighteningly silent. I was, in a way, in control, but I also didn't know where I was going. And it was at that moment, when the feeling of emptiness began to intensify, that doubts began to arise. Was I really ready to embrace this new life? Was I ready for the challenges that would come? And more importantly, what would happen to the relationships around me? It was then that I decided I needed a break, not from life, but from the frantic routine of being someone constantly exposed, someone who was now seen by others as the woman who wrote a book. I didn't know how to deal with that. I didn't know how to behave when people started looking at me differently. I didn't want my life to be reduced to that. I didn't want to be just the book or the music. I wanted to be more than that. So I decided to travel, a distant place where no one knew me, where I could step out of the shadows of my own creation and just be. And that's what I did. I planned a trip to a small coastal town, a tranquil refuge where I could feel the wind on my face and the sea breeze remind me of my freedom. The trip was an important step. I didn't know if it would bring me answers, but I felt I needed this break. The sea, with its immensity, seemed to be the only place where I could hear myself without external distractions. Being there, alone, made me feel that the true journey was not in my book, but within me. It was time to truly understand who I was, without the expectations of others, without the opinions that now arose about my work. In the first few days in the coastal town, I spent my time walking along the beach, watching the waves break on the rocks. It was as if the sound of the sea washed my soul, bringing a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I finally managed to silence the whirlwind of thoughts that constantly consumed me. The fear of acceptance, the pressure to meet expectations, the insecurity about my next choice, all of that was there, on the sidelines, while I simply observed the landscape. But something inside me still didn't feel at peace. I was living my life, yes, but with a weight that I didn't know how to share. Perhaps it was the fact that my story, my truth, was now exposed to the world. I had revealed myself, and with that, the expectations of others became a constant in my mind. It was then that I found a small art gallery in the town that a sense of clarity began to form. I entered out of pure curiosity, but soon found myself absorbed by the works on display. Paintings, sculptures, and especially photographs that captured the essence of the human being in a raw and sincere way. Each image seemed to have a story, and somehow, I began to realize that art didn't have to be about perfection. It was about vulnerability. It was about being seen for who we are and not for what people expect us to be. The gallery owner, an older woman with a welcoming smile, invited me to stay for a chat. We spent hours talking about art, about life, and about the power of human expression. She told me that she had started her career late after losing her husband, and that the fact that she had waited so long to follow her dreams made her realize something important. Art, my dear, is not about what the world wants to see. It's about you. When you create for yourself. And what others see is just a reflection of what you are willing to show. Those words stayed with me for days. I wasn't creating for the world. I was creating for myself. The book, the music, the life I was trying to build were not about meeting expectations. They were about being true to what I felt, and perhaps for that reason, the weight of choice was so great, because by choosing, I was exposing myself. I was showing what, in fact, was inside me, and that was terrifying. I returned to the city with a new perspective. I knew that fear would still be part of the journey, but I also knew that it was in it that I would find the greatest challenge. Not the fear of being rejected, but the fear of being truly seen. The fear of exposing myself completely, without reservations. The fear that my vulnerability would be seen as weakness. When I got home, I sat at the table and looked at the manuscript that now seemed distant. I was ready to give it to the world, but only now, after my trip, did I understand something fundamental. The biggest challenge was not about public acceptance. It was about self-acceptance. I couldn't expect to be accepted if I wasn't willing to accept my own vulnerability. That night, I decided I would take the next step. I didn't know what would happen next, but I was ready to move forward. I was ready to continue being who I am, without fear of what others might think. Chapter 12. The Courage to be Seen. I never imagined that freedom would have so many faces. It wasn't just about making my own choices, about writing my own story. It was also about exposing myself, about being seen for who I truly am, without masks, without the need to hide my weaknesses. That was the hardest part of it all. Because when you expose yourself, there's no turning back. The world sees you in a way you're not always prepared to face. When the book was finally released, what I feared most happened. The reactions started coming in. Some were quick, others took longer, but all were relentless. Comments from readers, media reviews, people who knew my story, others who had never heard of me. The world began to look at me in a new way. I was no longer the unknown woman from before, but an author, and that brought with it a pressure I didn't know how to handle. I spent the first few weeks hiding at home, reading the comments, sometimes with pleasure, sometimes with inexplicable pain. Some praised the book, said it was a moving work, that it had touched their lives in some way. Others, however, were not so kind. Criticisms began to emerge, and not all were constructive. Some said my writing was weak, that it lacked depth, that I was trying too hard to expose my pain. These moments were difficult. I spent sleepless nights, wondering if I was really good enough to do this. I thought about all the moments I dedicated myself to music and writing, and I wondered, am I just creating another illusion about who I am? Is this really who I am? Or just an attempt to fill the emptiness I've always carried? It was then that I decided I needed a break, not from writing, but from the weight of exposure. I couldn't continue living under this constant pressure of being seen. I needed to find myself again, to remember who I am without the eyes of others watching me. With that, I decided to step away for a few days, not to run away, but to find myself again. I went to the same place where I found my clarity, the small coastal town, the place where the sound of the sea made me feel like I could breathe, where no one knew what I had done or who I was, where I could just be me. In the days I spent there, alone, walking along the beach and watching the sea, I noticed something that had previously escaped me. I had become obsessed with the need for approval. Not just Hank's, Jenna's, but the approval of others, of anyone who looked at me and said I was doing the right thing. But I was forgetting that the most important thing was how I saw myself, what I really thought about myself. I didn't need anyone's approval. I needed my own acceptance. I looked at the horizon, the wind blowing in my face, and I felt stronger. It was as if the sea had washed me clean inside, and I finally understood that true courage was not about facing external criticisms or fears. True courage came from within, the courage to accept myself without needing validation from others, to show myself to the world as I am, with all my flaws, my pains, and my joys. When I returned home, I didn't know what would happen next. Fear was still there, but in a different way. I no longer had the expectation of being accepted. I was no longer trying to convince anyone that I was good enough. I simply was, and that, in itself, was a big step. The book continued to be discussed, and reactions continued to emerge. But I no longer cared so much about negative reviews. I understood now that they were part of the process. It wasn't about pleasing everyone, but about being true to myself. I decided to continue writing, not for others, but for myself. I knew that if I could be true to myself in my words, the rest would come naturally. If people wanted to read, let them read. If not, let them not read. What mattered was that I was creating my own story, a story that was authentic. That's how the pressure of visibility diminished. I no longer had to fight to be seen in a specific way. I just needed to be who I am. And, as I accepted that, I became freer. Chapter 13. The Last Confrontation. I knew the end was coming. The feeling was strange, as if the world had stopped for a moment to observe me, waiting for me to take the last step. I had already come a long way, but there was a part of me that still felt incomplete, as if there was something I needed to face, something I could no longer postpone. The book was a success. I was receiving messages from readers, compliments, criticisms, and even some words of comfort. I was being seen, finally, in a way I never imagined. But visibility, as I discovered, had its price. Sometimes, sweet words were followed by biting criticisms, and although I knew that was normal, there was something that bothered me. People saw something in me that I wasn't prepared to fully show. They saw a woman who overcame pain, a woman who found the courage to write her story. But I knew my story was not yet complete. I was in the studio, trying to write the missing words, but something prevented me from continuing. There was a feeling of disconnection, as if I was losing control of something that had been so important to me. I knew that my journey of self-discovery was not just in the book. It was in the way I related to others, in the choices I made to rebuild my life. But what was missing? What was still trapped inside me? It was then that, in the midst of my reflection, the phone rang. I looked at the unknown number and hesitated for a moment, but answered. The voice on the other end made me freeze. "Maggie, it's me, Hank." The sound of his voice took me back in time. Everything I had worked to leave behind came to the surface at that moment. The past, the betrayals, the lies, the broken promises. I took a deep breath before answering. "What do you want, Hank?" I knew the time had come to deal with him, once and for all. The words he would say wouldn't change anything, but I felt I needed to hear what he had to say, because somehow it would be part of my closure. I couldn't continue living my new life without truly confronting him, without truly facing the last shadow of my past. "Maggie, I know what I did was unacceptable. I know I lost everything. But what I didn't know, and what I never imagined you would see, is that I never loved you enough," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't know what to answer, so he continued. "I see you now, and I realize how strong you were to move on, but at the same time, I feel a deep pain for having been responsible for making you suffer. I didn't know what to feel. The hatred, the anger, the pain, everything seemed so distant. Was he apologizing? Or was he trying somehow to play the victim? I no longer knew. "I don't need your pity, Hank," I said, my voice calm, but with a firmness that surprised me. "I don't need your regret. I have already freed myself. What you did to me no longer defines me." I was serious. I no longer needed him. But at the same time, there was something in his words that made me question if I had truly forgiven everything. He was trying to ask for forgiveness, and perhaps what he needed was not my anger, but my silence. Because deep down, I no longer wanted him to be part of my life. "I just want you to know that it was never about you, Maggie. It was never about what you did or didn't do. It was about me," he said, as if a part of his humanity was finally appearing. "I am responsible for everything." And there, at that moment, something inside me broke. Not from anger or resentment, but from a silent understanding. He was trying to do what he could no longer do, trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. And deep down, I understood. Forgiveness, if I ever granted it, was not something he would need to move on. It was something I needed to free myself, to no longer carry the weight of it. "You already lost me, Hank," I said, my voice softer now, "and I have already lost the need to be part of your world. There is nothing left between us." The line went silent, and I knew that, by saying that, I was not just putting an end to what had been. I was putting an end to myself in that story. I was no longer the woman who waited for an apology. I no longer needed him to accept me. I was, finally, at peace. I hung up the phone and looked at my studio. The silent room now seemed fuller than ever. There were no more screams, no more repressed feelings. I had done what I needed to do. I had put an end to the past, and now, with the lightness of someone who understands herself, I was ready to take the next step. And the next step, now, was not about Hank, nor about the book, nor about what I did or didn't do. The next step was finally about who I am. I was ready to be seen, not for what others expected, but for what I, now, allowed myself to be. I finally freed myself, and, in doing so, I found what I had always sought, peace. The peace that comes when you can finally look at the past, not with anger or regret, but with the understanding that everything that happened somehow was necessary to make you who you are. And when later, I went to my studio and sat down to write again, the words flowed like never before. Not because I was trying to please someone, but because now, more than ever, I knew that my true story was just beginning. Final chapter. The freedom to be the sun was setting when I reached the top of the hill. I didn't know why I was there, but the silence of that afternoon seemed to call to me. The gentle wind touched my face, as if the world was inviting me to breathe deeper, to embrace that moment with an intensity I had never known existed until then. I didn't know what the future held for me. In fact, after everything I had lived, the only thing I knew was that nothing would be the same. There was no longer the weight of guilt, nor the weight of others' expectations. I was, finally, ready to walk at my own pace, in my own direction. That afternoon, everything seemed to fall into place in a way I didn't know was possible. The peace I felt was not the kind of peace that comes from an absence of conflict, but the peace that arises when you accept who you are, with all your flaws, failures, and perfections. I looked at myself and, for the first time, I truly saw myself, without the filters of pain, without the voices of others telling me who I should be. I was Maggie, with all my experiences, my scars, and my victories. The book was published, and although I knew it wouldn't define me, it became an important part of my journey. Writing was no longer a way to hide or to prove myself, but an expression of who I am, a liberation of what I needed to understand. When people read my words, I no longer felt the fear of rejection, but the joy of being able to share such an intimate part of myself. I was no longer a hostage to what others thought. I was finally at peace with my own voice, but it wasn't just the book. It wasn't just the success that came with it. What truly touched me, what truly gave me the feeling of being whole, was what I had achieved within myself. I was, for the first time, living without the shadows of the past, without the constant search for something that always eluded me. I no longer needed approval. I no longer needed validation from others. I was allowing myself to be, and that somehow made everything that came before seem distant. That afternoon on the hill was just a reflection of what was happening inside me. I knew the world would keep turning, and that, like everyone, I would have my challenges. But something inside me had changed. I no longer feared life, nor the future. I knew that, no matter what happened, I would have the strength to face it. Because true freedom does not come from getting rid of everything that imprisons us, but from accepting who we are, with all our imperfections and beauties. I was no longer chasing an idealized version of myself. I was living authentically, and that gave me a deep peace. The relationships I had lost, the choices I made, all were part of who I am now. None of that needed to be erased. I no longer sought to erase what I had lived, but to understand that everything I went through brought me here. I turned to go down the hill when something inside me made me stop. A thought, a vision, like an epiphany. It wasn't the end of my journey, but just the beginning of a new chapter. What awaited me was not something I could predict, but I knew I no longer needed to be afraid to move forward. True freedom was not the absence of obstacles, but the courage to walk, even when the path seemed uncertain. I smiled to myself, not because I had everything figured out, but because, for the first time, I knew I didn't need immediate answers. I no longer had to rush or worry about what others thought. I was enough. And, as unpredictable as the future might be, I was ready to embrace everything it brought me. I walked back home with the feeling that not only was the sun setting, but a new phase of my life was beginning. The sky was clear, the stars were starting to appear, and I was there, looking at the infinite, knowing that I, finally, had found peace within myself. I no longer needed to fight. I was finally home, with myself.
I walked through an empty field where shadows followed me. I left the things I don't want, but I found what I need. I heard the sound of my pain, and I learned to belong with it. Now I see at long last. Now I am free, no longer lost. alone. But the sun came to guide me, and I saw myself in the notes of my music, the truth that made me reborn. And I know now I am whole. Every piece I lost made me stronger, more alive. I found